There you go. Perfect. So closing out the housekeeping part of the agenda, I just want to make sure we did have a presentation that was requested originally, I think, from the HL7 Canada community, but because of its relevance, I think, to our larger, FHIR implementers community, we are going to we've asked Tilla Farkas to present on the Canadian FHIR Exchange Specification, also called CAFEX, to provide an update on where it is and where it's going. That's going to likely be rescheduled for our February 3rd governance call, just to keep things in line with our own sequencing. And
yeah, Attila has accepted February 3rd.
Beautiful. Okay. So we'll have that. Similarly, it'll be recorded. We'll have it up on the OwnCloud for anyone that can't make that time work. But we just want to make sure we're closing the loop, given the the relevancy of the content to many of us here. The other two items on the agenda, and then I'll do a call out if there were other topics that we want to make sure that we addressed. So we've had a couple rounds of kind of governance discussions since November, but our November 25th call focused on, after hearing about the initiatives that are undergoing around the common and harmonized data models, and the work that's being done to bring that to our standards community here in Canada. We had a targeted session that basically said, how should we be looking at the activities that we're doing in the next 6 months to both contribute to that and to also kind of reduce any confusion that may stem from content that we've written about next steps for the baseline, that they may continue to evolve based on that work. And so the two activities that the team felt, this is a safe way, a good place to apply our effort, was in making sure that we are cleaning up our project and guide, going through as a group and making sure we're catching any of those areas and we're comfortable with the language that we are replacing in its stead, just to essentially reduce any further confusion and potentially replace with pointers that can promote that work and promote our readers into understanding, how they can, engage with those additional initiatives. And the third being, we've done a lot of work in the development and the refinement of the profiles to essentially note anything that was kind of removed through our various phases that was originally proposed and thought this might be an important candidate if we were to be more prescriptive or more candidate for the core. So, a second activity kind of introduced into our governance kind of goals of this kind of 2023 year being, compiling that list together so that, we do have it in a single place, because through our, our own maturity, we've used our GitHub issue log to track some things. We've now moved to our FHIR issue log. And we want to make sure anything that would be insights that we've heard from our community members would be present and available in a single place we could contribute to these initiatives. So those being the primary focus for today, and then just a quick follow-up on the BAPE process. Is there anything that folks, and I haven't had a chance to check out the participants yet, but is there anything that we want to make sure that we're adding to our governance agenda for today? I don't know if there's folks from ChiHi or InfoWay that want to kind of update us on ways that we can kind of better provide them with these details. But that was the only other item I think we were kind of passively tracking.
Can I ask a question? I don't know if this is the proper forum to ask this or not. It's Sandra from Alberta. I'm still not quite clear on the core in the direction we're going and whether or not the baseline is disappearing or if the baseline is feeding into the core or what's going to happen around that work.
So Sandra, that's a really great question. It's something that I guess I'll start by asking, were you able to attend? There was a presentation in mid-November that was specifically around, how is the baseline going to be used? What's the kind of the initial steps that both the ChiHi and the InfoWay teams are going to be using for this? that's present, and I'll put a little, I'll put the targeted file here. Our understanding right now, and as an independent grassroots group, is that the baseline will be leveraged in the work that's forthcoming. The amount of how it will be leveraged, whether or not a formal mechanism is employed for reprofiling, or it's informative, or it's used by in certain domains, while others are still emerging, that's still to be determined per what we heard in mid-November, right? And so our goal is to allow for those folks to have a little bit of time in the early weeks of January before coming back to us for a formal update, and for us from the baseline perspective to try to look at what our own activities are within that window to make sure we're not tripping over each other.
Yeah, because there will be some impact for those of us who created profiles that inherit from the Canadian baseline.
Yeah, reprofiling, Lorraine, you're referring to.
Yeah, so our practitioner and practitioner role profiles, for example, inherit from the Canadian baseline. So, as that shifts and we get clarity on baseline versus core and what the direction is, there's going to be a little bit of thought process required to figure out what we're doing.
And some of it may require, our thinking is, we are a community of implementers. Some implementers are using it more from an informative standpoint. Some are using it more from a formal reprofiling standpoint. So we may have to have that bi-directional. These are the impacts if you were to choose this mechanism over this mechanism. Oh, perfect.
yeah,
Emily, thank you for I was
great.
just
And we're already formally inheriting on some of our profiles.
So that's
PLR, right?
What I just dropped into a chat is a link to the FHIR. Is it FHIR? Anyways, there was a frequently asked questions document created by FHIR and InfoWay, and I just linked the thread for that, so you can take a look at that thread, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in that thread.
Perfect. And yeah, the slides.
Okay, thank you.
That way as well.
Yeah.
This slide, the FAQ that was sent out about this after the meeting actually was different than what was stated in the meeting for some items. So the FAQ basically says that baseline is dead, not going to be going forward, other than they'll extract what they want from it and then it's going to be killed off. Yet in the meeting, they said otherwise, that it was more or less going to be used.
So I think one of the questions is that a core is generally for specific domains, where a baseline is not. So I'm not.
That was my understanding in the meeting, but in the FAQ, they're saying different. Like, people should really read the FAQ to see, because it is different. If you listen to the recording, then read the FAQ, you'll see they're different on several important subjects.
So from our perspective, does it make sense? I'm wondering, I know obviously the folks from InfoWay and ChiHi are kind of deep in the weeds right now. We want to make sure we're delivering feedback to you in the right channels at the times when it's helpful in shaping that approach. Does it make sense if we were to kind of go through the FAQs and compile, perhaps this wasn't originally, I think, our activities that we've previously discussed, but compile remaining questions that we have so we can provide that back to the team, or points of clarification? Would folks find that helpful? Because that would be a formal channel. We haven't actually looked at the FAQ together. We've had the presentation as a team, but not dug into the kind of post-dated FAQ.
I think that would be very helpful. And keep in mind, I just want to, we've had this conversation also on the Canadian channel and also with Canada Council in terms of the challenges associated with the definition between baseline and core. And I had pitched a notional definition very, to clarify between those two things. I'm actually going to pitch that to the HL7 International Council at the upcoming working group meeting and see what their feedback is. And then we may make a resolution that we pass on to the technical steering committee to formalize that definition, which would help bring clarity to our situation in Canada, not just for us, but potentially for the other jurisdictions. And it's very helpful if that clarity comes from HL7 itself, because right now it's absent and it's really confusing. And as I pointed out to people, their core and a baseline are not the same. And they're just as Joni expressed, where core is a representation of a fire specification that has been contextualized for a particular purpose, to be fit for purpose. And that has to rely upon some kind of common framework, because you're going to have lots of these for different purposes that actually have a mix of fire profiles attached to them, right? So I think there's a very, very legitimate role for a baseline as opposed to the core, and a very legitimate role for the core as opposed to the baseline, but we have to view them as distinctly separate things. And I don't think we've landed that yet, either internationally, but definitely not in terms of the Canadian context. So I would be a big fan of taking a look at the FAQ and then using that formal channel with InfoWave particularly, just so that it's on the books, it's for the record that we're having this kind of conversation. And I think
Ron,
there's
how do you
just
want to weave that in the piece around? Because does it make sense for us to look at the definitions as part of this FAQ review?
yes,
Or
yes,
are they?
yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think that's exactly what we should choose to do. I'll have more, if I gain agreement on that at the International Council level and we make that resolution for the TSC, now you've got something substantial to base that on, because I think the definition as I've provided to you is really the result of a synthesis of my conversations with, frankly, fire experts that are familiar to me and who've been doing this stuff for a long time. And it seems extremely practical, pragmatic, and very useful to have those definitions, and the clarity between them is very helpful. So I'm optimistic we can get that fixed. And also it goes, frankly, to the role of HL7 Canada in terms of the context of what will be evolving in multiple projects across multiple jurisdictions. There is a role for the larger community to work together around shaping the conceptual definitions, really, was what you're getting out of the baseline. And that have been already, if you will, that first pass of alignment with Canadian concept representation, or the way that we use these concepts in Canada. And then from that point, when someone wants then to create something that will be considered a core standard for a particular domain or for a particular use, they've got the baseline to rely upon. And then as subsequent cores come along, they're inherently consistent because they've been based on the same baseline in terms of their representation of concepts. How they're used and what's going on with that particular interface, that will be contextualized for that particular purpose. But at least we have the definitions consistent, and I think that's absolutely essential.
Okay, so what's
Ron,
oh, go ahead.
sorry.
Sure.
If you were to approach somebody in the US and say to them, what do you think of the idea of having 3 or 4 US cores? Do you think they would accept that, or say that's ridiculous? There is only a single US core.
I think, sorry, Ron, I shouldn't answer for you, but once you answer, I'll give you my opinion from when I was on the US Realm Steering Committee. So Ron, you're talking to me.
Shoot, sorry, I keep clicking and unclicking. How do I describe this? I don't think, as a matter of fact, I know for sure that the US realm doesn't see this disambiguation of the concept of baseline versus core. And secondly, their definition of core is the particular purpose that core serves for them, stemmed from Argonaut, and is now firmly around the ONC specifications and their requirements there. So it's a collection of expressions and things that are there that are for that overt purpose, which is in a US context to meet ONC requirements. That's what the context is.
So
Yeah.
I'll actually differ with Ron's opinion on that slightly.
Okay, sure, go ahead. That's my understanding.
Because when I was still on US Film Steering Committee, this came up, and Graham brought back particularly as the administrative and payer space was starting to develop profiles, because US Core is US CDI and its
Yes.
domain is just clinical.
Okay, even more constrained. Yeah.
The domain, the need for a baseline came up, and Graham was pushing it for a while. And the challenge was, of course, because the ONC pays for US Core and the US CDI, that there wasn't the resources to deal with the baseline, which, although they recognized at the time that conceptually it was needed.
Yeah.
So they came up with a process whereby if you need to differ from US Core because your business requirements aren't the same, you need to formally log a ticket and notify US Realm. And the thought was that what they would do, rather than start a US baseline right now, was that they would gather those tickets and those needs as a requirement statement. And at some point when they had the resources to do a baseline, they might do a baseline. I'm not confident that they'll ever have the resources to do a baseline.
Yes. Thank you, Lorraine, because that does actually mirror the conversation. So I didn't have quite the appropriate level of specificity there, but on that note, Elliot, in essence, they've already set a pattern where they would need multiple US cores, right? Because if it's just for that narrow purpose, that's not going to be sufficient for all the things that are needed, even, by the way, for ONC over time. They just don't know that yet, I think. I don't think they really appreciate it. And or, to Lorraine's point, they're choosing a different mechanism to at least build that set of requirements or build increased awareness of the necessity for the baseline. And I'm not sure, what they'll do about it otherwise. But bottom line is, part of the problem with the fact that people are coming and have to put a ticket forward where there's a variance or some other utilization of the thing other than what's in core is because there is no baseline. If there was a baseline, they wouldn't be having such a problem with it.
Other countries have done baselines too.
And then I want to just pause the conversation there, because
Sure.
I think we've had this conversation,
Yes,
and it's a
we have.
continuation of what we've talked about on the Canada Council call. But I want to be, acknowledge that there are folks that that may be getting caught up on this topic. So I think that, circling back to summarize, there's nothing that when we started or currently was written in stone for what is a baseline, what is a core, what is a base. We are at a point in our community, our international community, where these definitions are being used incongruously with varying patterns of implementation and funding. What's happening at the international level with the affiliates is they're attempting to start to form some of these definitions. And as an implementer, we're experiencing the growing pains they're attempting to deal with in our own community, as we have an established baseline and had a belief on what a core would look like that grew from that, but also have naturally developing initiatives that may fulfill some of these requirements. So what I want folks, don't get overwhelmed if this seems like a lot and you haven't heard this conversation before. Just acknowledge that it's something that is in the works, and it's probably important for us when we start to go through this, to acknowledge that we may be using some definitions for concepts because it's how we're collectively understanding and talking about it that may change, right? And what should be more about talking about our use of these concepts and where they fit together and how we work with a program that does X, than getting too caught up in the semantics, because they could change from here, I think, is one of the things that was a point that Ron made, in addition to these definitions asserting the importance of having multiple layers. So in the interest of trying to work through this process, what I'm going to say, the other point of grace that I'm going to ask for folks, because we are reviewing content, and we may not have the people who develop that content in full on the call with these FAQs, is to just acknowledge that we may not have the answers for some of our questions on this call, or we may not have the right people. So acknowledging that up front. If we knew we were going to dive into it ahead of time, we could get a lot more folks on the call. But I think what our job is now is to go through this, react as a community, and document our questions and put them through that channel. So I'll say that before I open it up, because
Yeah,
I want us to have some grace in this space.
That's very well said. Very well said. Thanks.
All right, so let me get this open. Okay, so like Joni said, we've got a thread that connects both the presentation and the FAQs. I'm just gonna what I'll do is I'll have it so that our FAQ is on one side while are folks comfortable? Do you want me to, I can make it small enough that I can document the questions on screen. Otherwise, I can jump between the two. What's preferred? Let me get it to the sizing so people can make sure that that's big enough first. And we'll just walk through it. Otherwise, what I'll probably do is just have my PowerPoint in a second screen and then bring back the questions at the end. Is that too small for folks? No?
Works for me.
Okay.
Not for me, but I've got giant screens.
I'll zoom in just a little bit more.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So one thing that you could do, Sheridan, if you do share area of the screen, you can cut out all the menus and stuff. If that helps people.
I don't know if. Well, if this works with folks, I mean,
Yeah, that's fine.
okay. All right. May give us some efficiencies, but not a ton gained. Okay. So I'm just looking at the FAQs because, in all honesty, I haven't had a chance to read through them. I'm going to guess the format, I'm just going to do a scan, is going to be probably starting with content that is presented within the presentation. And I'm going to guess there's a sprinkling of, there were some outstanding questions that people had following the presentation. But let's just start at the beginning, right? So provided during the live sessions have been edited. Okay, for clarity and accuracy. So will the data model include, let me just make sure. Will the data model include, you folks can see my screen, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Data definitions or data dictionary. I know this was a question that was asked during the session, and the response being intention to include data definitions within the data model. In terms of questions that you may have or points of clarity around this, obviously we may want more detail that would come out in the future, but are there any concerns that we want to raise on this particular answer? I think this was your desire. I think, Ron, you had originally raised this question, and with the goal of this being a really important aspect of a data dictionary, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I would concur that it's important. And just figuring out how we get to be able to see that stuff as it's being worked on is one of my questions and concerns ongoing.
And from because I also want to balance, these are questions that we have as community members, but we should be speaking from a lens of the CA baseline, right? That's what we are communicating in the channel that we're using here. Is the goal so that we can make sure that they're in sync with how we have understood them to operate within our implementations and the CA baseline profiles?
I was more, well, I guess that's an indirect consequence of the goal to make sure that things are consistent and we understand how they're going as we're trying to develop it, with my hat on as a contributor to jurisdictional standards. Right? So we are interested in how it's being developed and how consistent it is with what we've already got and where it's going. Right? So knowing how we can see and participate and know what's happening, I guess, is because they did say that that would be possible, but it wasn't clear yet how it was going to be possible. So that's a question that will be answered, I assume, sometime in the future.
Okay, is it fair if I say, obviously we're coming at this primarily from a place of implementers, but there's probably some tie into understanding how it may impact our efforts in the baseline.
That's provided the baseline has a future.
No, absolutely, but I think you have to assume that. So yes, I
Okay.
agree with that.
Okay. Anything else on this question before we move to the next one?
That answer isn't specific to that question though, or that.
I'm sorry, yeah, I was gonna use the numeric convention, but we'll just say data dictionary.
But I don't think developing the data, the concern of will we be able to see this in development and contribute during development?
Oh, you're
I
saying
don't
it's
think
more
it's
broad.
specific. Yeah,
Got it, okay. Is that how you meant it, Lorraine?
Well, yeah, Elliot is appropriately expanding my comment beyond just looking at the data definitions to looking to understanding the development, and it's an appropriate expansion. But I was trying to keep myself to the question at hand.
Okay, let's go back to more generic questions at the end and see if there's further that fall into this bucket. So this is regard to the definitions that would go along with the data dictionary. The second question being a clear distinction and definition between the concepts of baseline and core. Baseline is definitional, and in this sense of this is how you structure a thing to effectively represent in a particular context. Core represents the notion of those things defined in a baseline. These are things that are now normative or validated and tested and to use consistently in exchanges going forward. So I think, Ron, this was a comment that you had made during the call, and it was around specifically the alignment with this emerging definition and our understanding of that, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so the response being recognize the difference between a Canadian baseline and a Canadian core, as described, as explained in the question. As discussed, the CA baseline was a grassroots attempt from the implementer community to jumpstart the FHIR data model conversation in Canada, so that early adopters had a tangible reference model. Not directly driven by solving for the data model considerations for any space, but it was best practices collection of national international trends. So that would be referring back to kind of us starting with US core and looking at other implementations.
Yes.
CA Core's focus driven data model definition project will eventually cover the entire ecosystem, and we'll start with these domains and workflows. Where applicable, learnings will be incorporated over time. And over time, the current CA baseline will be retired and replaced by CA Core. So that's, I think, what you're honing in on, Sandra and Randy, around deviation, I think, from what was originally communicated, right?
Yeah.
So how do we phrase that back, right? I think we're pushing back against this as a is it that we need more information on this? Is it that we're asserting that there is, these clear places where we anticipate the baseline will be used even before we know what the core will cover?
That comes back to the discussion that we had earlier. That's, says the baseline and core are different, and they each have their place. So the fact that they're asserting that baseline will be retired and completely replaced, I think, is an assertion that I would not encourage.
This was the big concern.
Yeah.
When I saw that, it took me from the point of saying we should bring baseline to our ISCA for incorporation to saying, why do we want to waste our time on baseline?
Correct.
Yes, that's where I'm still confused.
And this was exactly the opposite of what they said in the meeting, in that baseline would continue to exist and be important, not be retired and replaced.
Yeah, and we're starting to publish guides based on baseline. It's
That's a big issue.
it is a huge issue.
Yeah, so I think that assertion was based upon an incomplete or faulty assumption regarding the equivalence there's a false equivalence, I think, between baseline and a core, where a core is more definitive, but fulfills all the same capabilities that a baseline doesn't. I don't think that's the same thing. I think it's just
Well,
it
it may not have all the same capabilities in the baseline because it's generally
right.
for a more specific use case.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
I think this is in progress, so don't panic. This has been as Sheridan very eloquently stated, something that's a known, issue in terms of definition and clarity. And we're working it just to be sure that we have part of the problem we had is while there was insight in terms of at the HL7 level, there is no common definition. So we're going to take a crack at trying to get that defined and formalized as part of the FHIR canon, if you will, of things. And then that'll really help clarify this. So that's where we're going.
Right, and that's what I understood was going to happen, and then we see this come out. So
Yeah, so it's great that we're going to work on improving the HL7 definition and the understanding and all of that. But the question is, what is CIHI and InfoWay's view of the distinction and the role, and do they we are going to replace baseline? If that's their view, it really doesn't matter what the definitions are from HL7.
It could also be, and this is I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, because we've been talking about the span of what does this mean in the next 1 to 5 years. It's possible, and without having folks on the line to confirm this, what they're thinking about more in this statement is very, very long term, right? After all domains and kind of vendors have aligned to this domain, there may be a need for retiring. I'm not sure the scale or the depth of this comment, but I think we can ask for it, and I think we can engage on it to say these are the spaces we think the baseline, given what we know in our community and given what we're seeing in other communities, does have play, even if we have coverage, this type of coverage, for instance, in other specifications.
I would assert that the baseline is required for the long term, not just the short and medium term, but that's my assertion.
And I think we've started to go down this path in terms of who the active users are, but we haven't really dove into a really clear, these are the ways that baseline would be used, even in a hyper evolved environment where, core had been around for quite a while. Are we anticipating, because I know Lorraine and Ron, you've talked about the definition and how others are using it internationally, that's something that we know at this point, that there's a definition for what that looks like, whatever post heavy implementation.
I think that's going to be part of the process of clarification of this definition, for sure, but I wouldn't say it exists at this moment.
But it's not just the definition, they got to come up with what is the scope of this
That's correct.
so-called CA core project, because as pitched, it's really like a PSCA kind of thing.
Yes, correct.
Not a Canada core, which we would all envision covering as a set of base resources to use for anything. So where are they going? They got to make that up, because they can't make this kind of statement for a thing that's going to target a tiny slice.
Yeah, agreed.
The other thing I want to pull out is some of our own language too. I think we, I do want to, hold on, let me see if I can't find it. We talked about this originally, and when we anticipated, that we would have to pull the boat on our own, we did have some of this language drafted, right? That talks about, it being a stepping stone, or it being, let me see where it is exactly.
Yeah, there was actually a section called core versus baseline, I think, in the IG.
Yeah. And so, you know, what I guess I'm trying to say is, I think we're all trying to feel what this looks like. We're a lot further along than when we originally wrote this language. And we're finding that the possibility for a core or a core-like program is a lot more realistic. It's closer than when we wrote this language. And so I think if we see, okay, a vision is crystallizing for how in the medium term and in the long term, these two things interact, then I think like it's our job to help, you know, provide some of those details. But I definitely think I don't know, I don't want to be too reactionary, but it's important that we do raise that we're getting mixed messaging here.
Yep, there's a couple comments here. It's Thomas. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'll just make it short because this is the conversation we can go along for days. And my comments here and the US baseline, the Canadian baseline, definitely there's a value there, but need our committee or working group to review and may reposition this profiles IGs and try to make it more distinguished with the other projects based IG or other FHIR profiles. That's one comment here. Second, most important, as I think surely you mentioned once before, as I remembered, the most important, how to make this baseline work sustainable. So in other words, I think you use the word where we can find the house for this baseline work. That's very important because we want to survive regarding the baseline project or working group here. That's very important. And regarding this, say, core, actually you provide a very good content here. And if we go back to the south of the border and the US side, and they do have a Da Vinci still alive there. And they do have a US core, which is actually can be utilized as a comparison to reflect the relationship between the baseline and the core. Da Vinci always, well, they are kind of the relation compete with each other and collaborate, which is with each other as well. So I won't give too much comments that will again last too long time, but just stop here.
Yeah, and I think you're referring to like this piece, right? Which is like, I think this was it, or maybe it was this one. When we talked through like what would be necessary to be sustainable in the long term, we knew that some level of engagement from our jurisdictions and some kind of collaboration between them to define and maintain, to implement and maintain the CA baseline and potentially as a place for the CA core to emerge was one of those initial like activities when we were drafting up our terms of use, we anticipated would be part of that. And so I think it is important to acknowledge that it's a pull, right? Like if maintaining the baseline the way that we thought would occur will require more than just the grassroots efforts that we've had to date. And so we have to determine how that gets balanced in this ecosystem, because I don't think that factor has changed, but the maintenance may, our degree of maintenance may change depending on where we end up, indicating this should go in the long term. So what I'm actually, because I want to make sure that I have enough space for kind of the various pieces, because I think we have some questions and some concerns, as I'm going to move these into separate buckets. So do we think this fairly kind of summarizes? It's like two pieces. We're asking for clarity on, what that statement means. We're trying to say, this is different than what we originally heard. And we want to assert that, as a grassroots group and folks who are implementing this, that, maybe I'll put in the short and long term So for folks that have started to actually utilize this in their implementations, as well as, you know, this belief that we still have to back, right, with the meaningfulness of continued use and maintenance in the long term. But that still has to be defined, and that's something that we probably have to work with them on, depending on where the definition for this work lands. Anything folks would add to this, and I'll go back to the document so we can see. So this is specifically targeting this question around the relationship that we want to make sure is added into our response.
Well, the only thing I can think to add here is that leaving it in this current wishy-washy state is going to make trying to get any kind of support for maintenance more of a challenge, because it's kind of like, who wants to build a Windows 7 application when Windows 11 is rolling out?
Mhm.
So solve that issue for the future lifespan of either project.
Which, if I'm going to amplify that comment, is a desire for clarity on the plans and the trajectories. So, you know, which domains, right now CA Core is going to start with primary care, as they say, for example. You know, where do they see the timelines? Where do they see R5 coming in? You know, some clarity on where things are going and how long we think the timelines will be. It's never going to be totally accurate, but the need for some understanding of where we're going will make the jurisdictions more comfortable to build on top of these things.
How about
Sorry, me just extra comment here. I think it may have to just share some of my opinion here regarding my understanding about the C baseline here, compare with this the case from the Da Vinci or maybe other US based project. Actually, my understanding that the US baseline, sorry, C baseline should be always standing on the cutting edge, and it should be the frontier liaison with HL7 FHIR International. That is actually another word from document perspective. C baseline should be a living document, always to be ready or to be proactive, to take all those new profiles or new technology. Compare with this, say, core, which is actually, I call it funding based, because there's no funding, no say core. And also it served specific business requirements. Definitely, say baseline also served business requirements in Canada, but there's unfortunately there's no funding to support it. However, if there's some funding there, that'd be great. But it's based on the vision of this grassroots community to decide what's the future. There's any kind of a new building block in the FHIR International, we would like to incorporate. We would like to encourage all those potential customers in Canada to utilize this, you know, maybe not never or seldom to go to the normative, but actually always, you know, stand at the very front line of those resources, but definitely being customized to fit in the Canadian environment and health sector, actually, per se. So that's where I can see some value here, but I won't go, you know, more go to further away because that will take quite a lot of time. Thank you.
And I think Thomas, you're referring to what typically we socialize in the baseline. So these are extensions or these are practices, but like is a slightly different mechanism from like enforcing those things.
Yeah, and it's exploring the business needs as are brought forward by the community and what business problems the community is trying to solve. Because don't forget that US CDI, by definition, only contains in the main part of the US CDI standard concepts that are already widely supported by most EHRs. And so it's very conservative of what it includes. And because US Core is supporting US CDI, it's often a much more constrained set of functionality than what we've been talking about in some of our business senses.
So I want to make sure, because I'm looking at the time, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm let's see if there's other question areas that we want to make sure we get around to. I'm going to guess that we'll want to probably extend this conversation into our next governance call as well. But let's see if maybe we can get through a few and then start to actually submit these back and hopefully have some answers in the meantime. So the second or this next one that is raised in the FAQ around Health Leadership Forum or Pan-Canadian Leadership Forum, and how open is that in terms of output and how representative is it? Seems that it's critical that an aspect of the governance model has authoritative people engaged. This might have been a question that came up in chat. But it looks like for the Pan-Canadian, for the patient summary and Canadian FHIR exchange work, the executive table was established. Then this is I think specifically the slide that is referenced within the document or within the presentation, was created to support these needs. There's an Info Central group on forum that's open to all, so that answers the kind of at least half of the open question. Questions on the forum are most welcome. So I'm gonna ask this. Sorry, go ahead.
I think the thing I would say about that, but prior to the presentations and the things we started to learn about around this in the last few months and at FHIR North, because the discussion was happening under the patient summary, I had no clue that we were talking about the kind of fundamental things that we were talking about there. I didn't pay attention to it because it was a domain I wasn't working in. But the fact that we're producing things like our data exchange standards and CAFX or whatever we're calling it under that, and that's where the discussion was, I think it meant it flew under the radar for lots of people who weren't involved in producing the Canadian version of the IPS.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the avenues where a lot of our implementers engage that aren't involved in every domain. And so I think it's, one of the responses to this is trying to get that CAFX presentation to this community. And maybe that's another thing is, in the new year, thinking about how we can open up to content that might be more FHIR implementers adjacent. But is there a follow-up or a point of clarity that we think from a baseline perspective beyond what's referenced here in the answer that we need to raise? From the baseline perspective, right? Or, if we continue to potentially open up some of our meetings to get some of this content, are we moving in the right direction?
I think from a baseline perspective, I think we probably just need updates when a specific domain project is starting to look at things that are broader in scope, and for updates to come back, I guess. I don't know what others think. That's sort of my opinion. Because I found that this wasn't as transparent as I would have liked it to be.
My sense regarding this, the really quick scan about this what I called CAFX or architecture reference architecture of those documents. And my understanding, they'll try to utilize this patient summary opportunity to build up an ecosystem in Canada-wide for this FHIR-based health information exchange, this architecture per se. However, my understanding is for our, say, baseline, I do believe we do have this capability to contribute. But however, what I worry about is the capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And I agree that, it makes sense to leverage a specific set of work to try to get some of those first principles down. But the fact that their discussion was just on the patient summary forum means that it flew under the radar for a lot of people. So that's that communication line. I think we need to improve the communication between the groups.
Okay, and that might be something we can chat about with the larger FHIR implementer group too, because I know like we've housed some of their content as well. Where it's like we meet regularly, and so it makes sense because many of us share people to try to get it in on a Friday, but probably something that we can operationalize a little bit better between the community groups.
Hey, Sheridan, I'm just trying to look at the original question for this. For this section. So I'm talking about the Health Leadership Forum and the Pan-Canadian Leadership Forum, but then the response is about patient summary and how that would, for that project, these were the groups that were used. So it's really a bit like a disconnect.
I wasn't sure if that's what this is referring to.
So when they say a corrected answer is provided here, are they saying that the patient summary group is where you get engagement for the Health Leadership Forum and the Pan-Canadian Leadership Forum? That's really confusing.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, they did say that the patient summary group is where people engaged and reviewed and the forums they used for review of CAFX and the architecture reference.
Right, but that doesn't
but-
really, yeah.
But like I say, I wouldn't have even looked at reviewing it because I wasn't paying attention to patient summary, because you don't expect to find, a reference architecture there.
Yeah, and it's not clear where CA core discussions are happening based on this response.
I believe that right now the CA core discussions are happening between InfoWay and CHI as they kind of map out where they want to go.
I mean, like because groups have not been engaged yet on it, like jurisdictional groups.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they're still very much in the planning state.
Yes. So they make it very clear, look, we're not trying to be, positional here. We're just beginning. And, we're going to keep working the problem. So I don't think we need to worry too much. I don't think there is a real set. There's some perspectives that have been offered, particularly in the FAQ, that are probably need some testing and some evolution as we go through this exercise. So I think we've got a little ways to go yet before we need to be, very concerned. I think at the same time, definitely, I think it's very apparent that there needs to be a broader accessibility, broader transparency, and a broader participation beyond the initial exercise needed for the patient summary.
And I think they're acknowledging that they need to have governance at the outset rather than trying to find the governance later. At least that's my sense of it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it's just they need that little bit of context in providing that answer in the Q&A.
Okay, so
I think also, publishing through things to the forum is, yeah, that's good visibility, but, the leadership table, how do you get invited to that? Who participates in that? Who are the people making the high level decisions? And is that involving the community? I recognize, things are still evolving. We're not asking for final answers right now, but some of that might be useful to have.
okay, so how about this? How to learn more about like this. So more clarity on where these discussions are happening, either now or indications of where they will happen after this kind of planning stage. More clarity of statement on where we're at in the planning process, and just how would participation and accessibility in these spaces look? So that being something that we would probably request out of this piece.
Yeah, and the corollary to that would be the identification of who are the official representatives, whether it's by jurisdiction or some other, so that if we had a question, we could go to our own jurisdictional representative and discuss it with them.
So via individually, right? So if you're thinking from the perspective of your jurisdiction or via our baseline, working group.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Because there will be some things that won't necessarily be open to everyone, right? But from what InfoWay has said, they are planning to have jurisdictional representatives in those fora. So to know who they are is useful.
yeah, because there are some of us, I don't represent a jurisdiction, right? I can speak and interact from the baseline perspective, but that's a fair point. I'm just looking, I think, a good deal of questions that are left. What I'll ask is twofold. Are there specific ones that we want to make sure that we target at the beginning of next or 2 weeks from now, the governance session, being judicial about what is a question that we have as a member of the community versus what's a question that we have and a concern that we have from the CA baseline and our activities within it. Are there any, for folks that have kind of seen this in the past, that you want to make sure we save time for next time to go over as a group?
Just to note, 2 weeks from now is the HL7 working group meeting.
Right. Okay. I have to note that with Mike. Right, because some people stay on for the full working group meeting. I think there's a handful of us that won't be present. I don't know, is anybody that's attending the working group meeting going to be able to call in? I think it would still be helpful to have if we thought we would have something like, more than 50% of our traditional attendance.
Well, the challenge is that if, for those that don't attend the working group meeting, Friday is usually a travel day.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I definitely wouldn't be able to call it. I don't know about Ron or Elliot.
Yeah, I'll still be there on Friday.
I won't be, I'll be out of there on Friday.
But will you be able to call into this call?
No, I don't think so. In terms of timing.
So one thing that we do have, our original we still need to go through this regardless of where the answers from our existing questions round up. There are still activities that we need to work through from a governance perspective to make sure that we're comfortable with, the changes that we'd be making within the guide and this compilation. We can move forward with this and put a pause. It'll be that would mean like a month from now would be when we would return to the Q&As. Alternatively, if there are questions specifically from the Q&A that folks want to raise from the baseline perspective, we can do that offline. I just want to make sure that we are being judicious in that, our goal has to be to think through the CA baseline perspective, even though I know we all have questions more broadly. So what's
just as a reminder, a month from now is the 3rd when we have Attila speaking to us.
Yes, for the first, I think it's 30 minutes.
Okay, so then we'd have 30 minutes to go through whatever's high priority.
Yeah. Alternatively, we can, I'm trying to think about what our profiling, we could, if folks are available this Friday, start to delve in, reuse one of our profiling calls instead. We just have to, it would be a bit of a quick turnaround, but I'm sure a lot of our profiling folks are on this call. Is that something we're more amenable to? I know I'll be traveling, but it won't be until after the call.
Yeah, I'm going to be traveling. So if other people are available, they should go ahead. But it's the Friday before the working group meeting. So.
Would
It's
folks,
also possible that we could do the Friday after the working group meeting, which is still before, the week before Attila's presentation, right?
oh yeah, the second profiling call. Brilliant. Yep. Okay.
Yes.
That would give us more of a time to let folks know who don't send their governance calls.
Yeah.
To give them the heads up on the change. So let's move forward with that. I'll put a note in that we will be using our call the following the working group meeting. Does anyone have that date off the top of their head?
It's the 27th of January.
Thank you. To resume. And any answers we've received in the meantime. I'm thinking, Joni, just based on the FAQ announcement on the thread, what I'll do is I'll just compile this in an email to that, contact us. And then if we do receive anything between now and January 27th, we'll just provide it on that call. Okay.
Thomas, did I answer your question about the QA slides?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
All right. So as usual, I think I will save this up, and then I know, Joni, we were working on the getting the recordings into OwnCloud, and I'll attempt to reload this one and see if we can't get it in, and if the presentation will also have the OwnCloud link if folks are interested in reviewing any of our past content.